Upon our next speaker, which is Bob Umlas of the USA. I do hope I pronounced that correctly. Are you there, Bob? Hello?
Now you can. I just became unmuted. Yes, thank you. I couldn't unmute
Wonderful.
myself.
Let me pass over to you for your presentation, sir.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. And, okay, can you all see my screen? Blank Excel file, can you see it? Oh, everybody's muted. Give me a thumbs up so I can see.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, okay, good. So my topic is to talk about data validation using Excel. And Excel, I don't know your experience in Excel. Let me tell you briefly a little bit about myself. I've been using Excel since its existence, since 1986, version 0.99 on a Macintosh. And I've been using it ever since. I'm now retired, but I've been given the designation by Microsoft as an Excel MVP, Most Valuable Professional, and I'm the longest running Excel MVP, 25 years straight, and not for the last 2 years, but I'm going to get back into the program. Anyway, so my talk on data validation is to make sure your data is the way you want it to be. So to do data validation, you go to the Data tab on the ribbon, and then there's a data validation. And if your screen is a little smaller, you may only see this little icon, but you click on it, hover over it, and you'll see data validation. And this is the data validation dialog. There are 3 tabs to it. You can allow any value, and you can allow just whole numbers, or just decimal numbers, or a list of values or dates and times, and we'll be going over these. But you can also specify an input message that when you select the cell, you get an idea of what's wanted. And if they type something invalid, like if you say you want only whole numbers and they type a decimal or they type a word, then you can give them an error message. And the error message could prevent them from going in, or you can just warn them, or just give them some information. And I'll show you all that in the next tab. So on this tab, all these cells are data validated. And if I click on this whole number, notice that it says, just by clicking on the cell, it says, please enter a whole number from 1 to 10. So if I enter 66, it gives me a message. You forget how to read, because I did give them a message. And if I put in 1.5, again, I get the same message. How this was done was I went to data validation. On the settings, I chose whole number. And when I choose whole numbers, if I start with any, this is the dialog. But as soon as I choose whole number, it gives me choices for between or not between or equal, a whole bunch of choices in here. And then I can say a minimum to a maximum. And then when I can click on the input message, and this says, please enter a whole number from 1 to 10, show the input message when the cell is selected, and the error alert. You forget how to read, and it prevents it from going in. And of course, if I enter a valid one, it goes in. So you can validate your data, make sure it's the way you want it to be. This is the same thing with the decimal. I didn't give any prompt. If I put in Bob, of course it says 1 to 10, please. Now, I didn't give you a prompt for 1 to 10. It just said decimal. I could have entered 12, and then I find out, oh, 1 to 10. But I could enter 3.5 because it's decimal. When I did list, you get a little drop down here. And this list is the months. This list is I'm sorry, this is the months. This is the days of the week. And this one is just a bunch of different things, apples and so on. How this was done, and let me just reduce this to only that so it's not in my way. So this list, if I go to the data validation, under the settings, I just typed Sunday, comma, Monday, comma. You just type in whatever list you want. No quotes, no nothing. If I needed a comma as part of the things in my list, like if I had a city and state as part of my list, I couldn't do it this way because the comma would separate them. I'll show you another way you could do that. This list below, data validation, I have a source and I typed in an equals R1 to R12, which is where I had the data. So I put it in someplace in the worksheet and I can just refer to it. On the last one in this list, data validation, I have the named range called fruit. If I click on here, you can see fruit is highlighted in column AD. So in case you didn't know named ranges, you can select a range and give it a name by typing something in here. I'll type Bob. And now that has a range name called Bob, and I can refer to it any way I want. Notice it shows up as Bob. I also have fruit states, etc. So this is kind of just how you use it. Let's go to, oops, wrong sheet first. Special date. This says enter a date after 2000. So the data validation for that, I allowed a date. That was one of the choices in this first one. And then I specified greater than, and I did greater than 12/31/2000. If not, I get a date has to be at least 1/1/2001. So if I enter today's date, that's fine. If I change that to 1995, I get the error message. So all this is about how to validate that the data that goes in is correct. Sometimes you have formulas, and like you might have equals this cell to the left times 20%. And that would work fine unless somebody puts in text, hello. And then you get these value errors, and that might propagate throughout the whole workbook, invalidating much of your work. But if you validate that this can only be a number or a decimal number, you won't get those value errors. Here's a length one, and I specify a text length, again, one of these, less than or equal to 7. So if I type in that, it's fine. But if I type in that, only 7 characters max, please. That's the error message. This gets more complicated, a social security number. If I type in 12-345-6789, that goes 12-34, oh, that's right. The dash was in the wrong for 123-45-6789. That goes in fine. But how do I account for that? That's done with a custom formula. So one of the things in here is custom, because social security number is not one of the valid choices. So this formula is a lot more involved, and rather than looking at it small here, I'm going to copy it and put it in here. And then there's a function called formula text, which allows me to show you what is the formula in that cell, and that I can make bigger so we can take a look at what it's doing, and you can see it better. So make that bigger. So a bunch of functions in here you may not be familiar with, but I think you'll follow it. The AND means all the things in this list must be true. The length must be 11, so it's the 9 digits plus 2 dashes. The middle part of it, starting with the 4th character for one character, has to be a dash. The middle part of it, starting with the 7th character for one character, must be a dash. And the last part is I have to make sure they're numbers. I can't do ABC dash EF dash XXXX. So it has to be true that it's not an error. When I multiply 1 times the first 3 characters concatenated or put together with the 5th and 6th character and the last 4 characters. So if that's an error, it's not going to be valid. So if I put in a Q here, it's invalid. So that's a lot more involved, but you can do almost any formula to validate it. This says any, and this is just a sample that you can just give a message. I can put whatever I want in here, because again, if I go back to data validation on the data tab, data validation, I'm allowing any value. Why would I do that? Just to be able to give a message. Please ensure that, yada, yada, whatever you want to say. So you just give them a prompt, and there's no error alert because I'm not preventing anything. This is a warning if the number is over 1,000. So I put in 1, 2, 3, it's fine. But if I put in 1, 2, 3, 4, it allows it, but I get a message. This value exceeds 1,000. Continue. So it's just a warning. If I say yes, it goes in, and it's fine. And that's done by, on the error alert, instead of stop, which is what we've been looking at, I give a warning. This third one called information is this last guy. Click in here, enter anything today. And it says, oh, that was informative. So those are the options you have. And now we're going to expand on these options and show you how you can make it even fancier. So one of the things I can do is allow only text entries. Let's make this a little bigger. So obviously that's text, and I'll put in another text, and they're all that way. If I put in 78, this cell accepts text only. So it's not allowed. Sorry, hold on, my phone is ringing, I have to ignore it. If I put in 78X, it's now treated as text, it's fine. That's done this way. On data validation, I have a custom, and there's a function called isText. I don't know if you can read that. Equals isText for, let's say that. It's now false because there's nothing in there. But if I put in an X, it turns to true. If I put in a 45, oh, let's change that. Instead of A, let's make it right below it. So if I put in 45, it's false. If I put in A, it's true. So isText is a function that allows for text. So if I click on that one only and go to data validation, I want to make a change, there's a checkbox here that says apply these changes to all other cells with the same settings. And I click on that, you see it selects them all. So then I can affect all the cells that I made these changes to, made it in isText, will be affected. There's also an interesting thing. Let's say I have the same thing here. I have Excel, I have Bob, but I also have a 78, and I have a conference. And this is the data I have, and now after the fact, after the data was entered, I apply the data validation. When I go in here and I allow a custom formula, and the formula I put on is equals isText, and when you put on a formula for either a range or a single cell, what you have to use is the active cell as the reference. Right now the active cell is G5. Even though I have the whole range, I could use just G5. And it'll apply it to everything in the selection. So I click OK and I don't get any kind of error message. I can't re-enter the same cell that's already there. I didn't give a message, so Microsoft gives this message. This value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell, but it's already in there. So when you apply data validation after the fact, how do you know if there's anything an error? On the data validation, there's a little drop down that says circle invalid data, and there it is. Now what's interesting about that, I can't select that circle. It's not selectable. It doesn't print. If I look at the print preview, it's not there. And there's nothing I can do with that circle except clear the invalidation circles. So I'd make the correction. Let's say I change that to text, and it goes away. Sometimes they don't all go away, or sometimes you just wanted to see what the error is. But let's go back to the 78. Oops, sorry. Let's go back to, I can't put 78 in there again. Let's undo. That's interesting. Okay. Well, in any case, I could do clear validation circles to get rid of them. Okay, here's another example of how you can use this. This data validation, again, let me make this bigger so it's easier to see. This accepts a value only if it's larger than the previous value. So if I put in here 100, it's not larger than the 155. It must be larger than the cell above it. If I put in 200, it goes in fine. If I put in text, it also goes in fine. I'm not going to explain that why. It turns out the text sorts after numbers, so it's effectively larger. But let's stick with numbers. So if I go to data validation, the formula is equals A4 is larger than A3. Why A4 and A3? It's because I selected cell A4. If I go to A7 and go back to data validation, it now says equals A7 is greater than A6. Now there's no dollar signs in this formula, so it's relative. What about the first one? Is this going to say A1 greater than A0? This one doesn't have any data validation on it. So starting, what I did was I selected this much, because A1 can't look at the cell above. Go to the data validation and use that. Relatively A2 is greater than A1, and it applies that, which again, A2 is the active cell. So it applies the active cell to the cell above and applies that to all. If I click on this, you see it. Well, I only did this one, and then go to data validation, click on this, you see it's all there. There's another way to see if there's data validation on the sheet. On the Home tab, under Find and Select, there is this choice for data validation. If I click on that, it shows A1 as having data validation, even though it doesn't. What actually is in there, back to data validation, is a data validation that says allow any value. If I clear it, click OK. Now I cleared the data validation from that cell. I would think that data validation, now it doesn't select A1. So most likely what happened when I was creating this, which I did a long time ago, is I did it for I did that, and then I made sure that this said data validation is allow everything. That is data validation, any value. And then if I'm selecting any value, it becomes part of a data validated cell. Okay, non-duplicates. Accepts only non-duplicated data. So if you have like a person's name, or more likely their ID, you have a list of people's ID, you want to make sure you don't enter it twice. So for example, if I enter a 45 in here, it's fine. If I enter a 4, the entry you made already exists in that range, A1 to C20. Please try again. And even though I just entered 45, it still recognizes it. So before I show you the data validation for that, I want to explain a function that perhaps you don't know, and it's called Countif. Countif takes, well, actually you can see by that, counts the number of cells within a range that meet a given condition. The condition is, I'm picking the range, all that, comma, and then I pick a criteria. Criteria is, let's say, 45. Count if that range equals 45, what? Count if, oh, it says I12. I meant C12, C5. Where did I get I12 from? And there's 145. But if I change the range to, let's say, everything in J and K for C5, it's giving me a 0. But if I put a 45 in here, and then another 45, and a 45 here, you can see it's counting them. So to make sure that there's no duplicated data, I have to make sure that the Countif returns a 1. There can only be one of them. So that's what, in fact, I did. Data validation is a custom formula, and this says equals the Countif of A1 to C20, and I used absolute references, and I'll explain why in a second, equals 1. That's what I'm allowing. I'm allowing the Countif to be 1. Otherwise, I give that error message. Now, in order to do that, to set it up, I had to select this first. I mean, I could have done it many other ways, but I did select that first. And when I went to the data validation, if I did not say with the dollar signs. If I just said the Countif of A1 to C20 for A1 equals 1, the problem is this is from the point of view of A1, because that's the active cell. So I click OK, and look what the data validation for this cell is. Countif C2 to E21. It keeps moving. It's 3 columns by 20 rows from the active cell. 3 columns by 20 rows from the active cell. So it's not what I want. I want it always to be A1 to C20. So I'm going to undo that. And that should put back the absolute. Okay, cascading. Here I have 2 data validations. If I pick fruit here, I then have apples, bananas, grapes, etc. But if I pick vegetables, I now have lettuce, broccoli, and cauliflower. And if I pick cars, I have the cars. And if I pick states, I have states. So how is this one changing when this one changes? Well, that's interesting. First of all, let's look at what that list is. Data validation for that cell is just AD1 to AG1. That's those cells over there. Fruit, vegetable, cars, and states. Now, one other thing to notice, that I have a range called fruit, which we've seen before, which is those cells. I have another range called cars. I have a range called states. And I have a range called, what did I miss? Vegetables. So how do I affect that? It's kind of interesting. Let's take a look at data validation and see what it says. So that's allowing that. That's not a big deal. But in the other one, data validation, there's something called indirect of A2, indirect of states. So let me explain indirect. Powerful function. If here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and here I have G7, that is plain old text saying G7, and here I have indirect of this. What the indirect does is it changes a reference, it changes a text to a reference. So the indirect of G7 is, whoops, indirect of G7 is G7. That doesn't make sense. Indirect, oh, that's right. I want G4, sorry. The indirect of G4, no, I want G3. That's where I put those numbers. Okay. The indirect of the text of G3 says treat G3 as a reference. So, or treat G7 as a reference. G7 contains G3, so it picks that up. Since I have range names, the indirect of states is this list of states. Now, if you don't have the latest version of Excel, that is either Excel 365 or they renamed it to Microsoft 365, this would not happen to you. You would get perhaps an error. But this flows down because of this new thing called dynamic arrays. So the indirect of states just picks them all up. You notice that this is normal black text, but these are light gray text because I didn't enter anything in that cell, but it flowed down. Matter of fact, if I have something in the way, I get what's called a spill error. It says, hey, I can't show you what you put in because you have something in the way. Get rid of it, and that's that. So if I change states to vegetables, this whole thing changes as well. And if I change it to fruit, that's what's going on in here. One problem with this is, supposing I pick a fruit like grapes. So far, so good. But if I change this to cars, it doesn't get rid of grapes. So I have a car that's called grapes, which doesn't make sense. And the only way to avoid that is by using a macro or something called VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. And I'll just show you that. I don't know your level of Excel. This particular VBA is not that tough. And it's interesting. I want to right mouse click the sheet tab and go to view code. There's no code in here currently. And I'm going to change general to worksheet. And instead of when I select change, I want to see what happens when I change something. So these are events, like if I deactivate the worksheet, if I change the worksheet, if I double click on the worksheet, all of these events could happen. So on the worksheet change event, the target is the cell that caused this to run. So when cell A2 changes, I want to clear out B2. So I can say if target, which is the range I put this in, dot address equals A2, then range B2 dot clear contents. And I don't need this. I did something, I need a quote in here. If target.address is A2, then range B2.clear contents. So let's see again. I changed cars to states, and B2 got changed. It's disappeared. And if in the states I pick California, but I change states back to fruit, it clears it out. I don't know if you can tell, but the name of this workbook is Data Validation on Steroids.xlsx. If I were to save this file, it says the following features can't be saved in a macro-free workbook. An XLSX file cannot store macros. So I'd have to resave it with a new name. To continue saving, click yes. If I click no, what I have to do is save as and change it from XLSX to XLSM, where the M stands for macro, and then I can save it, which I'm not going to do. Because if I just saved it and said yes to that, this code would just disappear because XLSX files can't hold macros. Moving on. Begins with A. Accept entry. Okay, let me make this bigger. Accept entry only if it begins with an A. Capital or not, that doesn't matter. So if I go to circle invalid data, there's none. If I put in hello, it begins with an H. Your entry must begin with the letter A. So let's show how this works. The left of A4. Now, that's because I'm in A4. So it was done by selecting the whole range first and then using the active cell, which is A1. The left of A1 must be the letter A. The left normally takes another parameter like the left of A1, comma 1, which means the leftmost one character. If I wanted to make sure they all begin with AL, I'd have to say the left of A1, comma 2 equals AL. Make sure it applies to all. I click OK, and everything's in there, but now data circle invalid data shows those two do not begin with AL. But the left function, if I leave off the comma 1, it assumes 1. So I'm just saying the leftmost character must begin with an A. Okay, here's a pattern where it begins with an A and it must contain 5 characters. So let's take a look at data validation for that. Let's make this selection. The Countif, which we saw before, A1, which is the active cell as a representation for all of these, quote, A question, 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 question equals 1. So let's take a look at what that means. Equals a Countif. The range is, let's just pick one cell, that. And the criteria being A, the question mark means any character. So I must have that many characters. 4 characters, doesn't matter what kind of character it is. And it says that has to be equal to 1. So it is 1. If I did another question mark, it would be 6 characters long. I could have done an asterisk, which means any number of characters. A and any number of characters. But that's how that part works. I just want to see, it looked like there was a question in the chat, which I want to look at. Is that the case? Chat, let me see. Okay, no, if there are questions, feel free to type them in and I will address them. Okay, next one is Monday only. So I'm putting in dates, but it must be a Monday. Again, that might be a function that you're not familiar with, so let's examine the data validation first and then take a look. There's a function called weekday. I'm allowing the weekday to be a 2. So if I put in, let's say today's date over here, and I go down this far, and then I look at, and again, let me make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. If I say equals weekday of that, and then fill that down, you see it goes 1 through 7, starting with a Sunday. So it's a Sunday to Monday week. That's what weekday does. Now weekday actually has other parameters. There's a return type. I might as well include this little tip. When you click, let's do it, when I'm typing equals weekday, when I do the open parenthesis, the word weekday in this text below is actually a hyperlink to the help file for weekday. So now it may look a little different when, depending on your version. In mine, it goes to a help task pane on the right. And there's a return, if I leave it off, which I did, the one or omitted is Sunday through Saturday. But I could specify I want Monday through Sunday if I put in a 2, etc. So these are the other options. Okay, close help. Close this. Okay, stay within budget. So the party budget is 500. The total so far is the sum of B1 to B6. If I go over budget, like 75 here, the amount you entered will exceed the budget. Enter a smaller amount. So that was done with the data validation. A custom formula, the sum of B1 to B6. Now again, I'm using absolute references, otherwise relative reference of B1 to B6 is fine for B1, but for B2, it would be B2 to B7, etc. The sum of B1 to B6 is less than or equal to the budget, which is in E6, E5. Otherwise, you get that error message. And then this one's labeled powerful, that it is data validation. If I click on this, and I click on this, I see pretty much what I'm seeing in column D, with all the blanks. Now is the time for all good men. To prove that this is accurate, I'm going to put in a ABC here, and click on this, and there's the ABC. So it's just a representation of that. This one is the same text, but without the blanks. And if I put in an ABC here, this now includes the ABC, except, wait a minute, there it is at the top. For a minute I thought it was missing. Notice it's in here, it's sorted, it's alphabetical. If instead of ABP I put in ZZZ, it's at the bottom. So that's interesting. So that's why this table, this one's called powerful. Let's take this back out. I actually don't remember what this last one is. Probably the same thing. Oh, it's done a different way. I'll show that in a moment. So this one, the data validation, is just D1 to D21, which is that range. So the word min is at the bottom. That's why he picks up all the blanks. This one, data validation, is equal to DV range, data validation range. This one is equal to L1 £. I'll have to explain that a little bit later. Let's first look at DV range. Let me see if there's a note in the chat. Okay, not for me. Okay, if I go to DV range, which is not listed here, so I have to go to, hit the F5 key, DV range. Oh, it's kind of hidden. So let me unhide all this. And it's involved. But you see this, well, let's explain it. Okay, this is, if you're not very comfortable with Excel, this may be a little above your head, but follow along. I think it will be very instructive. So, this one is, okay. So let me hide L for now because it doesn't apply yet. So this is this one, let's take this function and make it bigger. Actually, I'll do it over here. Let's do it down here, equals formula text. So you can see it better of H1. Not, I didn't mean the asterisk. That's the function that's in H1. It has an index, it has a small, it has row, so I need to explain those. Let's start with the easiest, the row of B1. Equals row of B1. What row is cell B1 in? Well, obviously it's in row 1. What row is cell B600, 666 in? It's 666. What row is XX 666? Well, it's in the same row, it's 666. The thing about that, when I fill it down, because filling down XX 666 becomes XX 667, so I get a bunch of row numbers. So the row of B1 in cell H1, when I fill it down, I don't know if you can see it, if I fill this down, sorry, let's take this to here. It says row of B2. So when I fill that down, it of course gets bigger. So the row of B1 is 1 here, and it's 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, etc. Let me explain a little bit more how that's useful. I have an if statement that says if D1 to D50, which is more than I needed to say, because it only goes to 21. But if it's equal to nothing, like when I hit these cells, the blanks, if it's not equal to nothing, so I'm only interested in now and is and the and time. If it's not equal, then I pick up that row number. So this will give me, let's do it actually in here because this is just a formula text. Let's pick this up. And if I highlight the if part and hit the F9 key and open this up, I see row 1, and then 4, and 5, and 10, which is where the text is. Row 1 is for now, row 4 is for is, and 5 is for the, and down to row 10 for time, and so on. So I'm getting this array. Passing that to the small function. Now the small function here is the small of the array for some number. The row of B1, if I hit F9, is 1. So what's the first smallest number in here? Well, that's a 1. So that whole small part becomes just a 1. The index function says in all of column D, what's the first one? Well, it's the word now. So this part, F9 again, says now. It's more instructive when I do this one, and let's do that with another one that might be instructive. If I go to Formulas tab and do Evaluate Formula, you'll see this take that apart. Hopefully you can see that. It underlines what it's about to evaluate. So the first thing it's going to evaluate is D1 to D50 not equal to blank. Evaluate, and I got a whole bunch of trues and falses. True, false, false, true. Not blank, 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 not blank. evaluate. And the next thing it's about to evaluate is the row of 1 to 50. And the row of 1 to 50 is the numbers 1 through 50. So now it's evaluating all that, all small, and we saw this already, 1, 4, 5, etc. It's now evaluating the row of B2. The row of B2 is a 2. The next one is, what's the second smallest of this range? And it should be a 4. There it is. The index of D for 4 is the word is. And that's how that works. Then I can restart this or close it. So when I fill this down, this works fine. But here I get a number because there is no 9th smallest value in that range. So I get a number, which is partly why I hid this. This function, this 8, says I'm matching the word true. And match says find in a particular range an exact match. With comma 0 says find an exact match for where there's an error in all of column, well, from H1 to H51. And it finds the error, the match part, F9, it finds an error, it finds that num in row 9, the 9th one. I'm subtracting 1 from it for a moment because I'm using that in a named range. If I go to name manager and I go to DV range, I'm sorry, I don't want to get offset. There's an RG. Let's copy that so you can see that here. Told you this wasn't trivial. Let's do it here. And I'll just paste the formula. That's the offset. An offset function says, starting with this cell, the first parameter is a start with. So starting with H1, going 0 rows down and 0 columns over. The next is what the shape of the range is. Number of rows is an I1, which is an 8. So, and then 1 is 1 column. So 8 rows by 1 column, that defines DV range. So when I go to DV range, oops, no, it wasn't called that. The name manager was RG. If I go to RG, it's that. That's what RG is. And I could have used RG in here. Data validation. Instead of DV range, I could have used RG. I thought I did. And I get the same thing because it's the same data. Okay. Don't need to do it that way. Didn't need this actually, so I'm not going to bother explaining it. So everything's still working. How this one was done, which is very different, it was done with column J now, which is hidden. So there's again, if you have the latest version of Excel, Office 365, you have what's called dynamic arrays. So one is, there's a sort and filter of both new functions. So let me start from scratch. So let me hide this all just so I can have more room to show you. And this is what is kind of in the hidden. Equals filter, new command. An array. The array is, let's say, all of column D. And what do I want to filter? I just want to include, is next. I want to include that whatever's in here is not equal to nothing. I want to filter that range, but not show blanks. And that gives me that. A lot easier. But not everybody has the dynamic array functions. Then there's another function called sort. And I sorted the filtered range. Oops, I don't need that at the end. Sort. And now that's what's being used in here. But what it said was L1 pound sign. So since I don't necessarily know the size of this, if I want to refer to this range, I would say equals P1. Normally I might say equals P1 through P8. Again, this is a new function, a new way of doing it. If you tried it and don't have the latest, all you would get in this one cell is the word good, because that's where it intersects. But if I do it this way, I get all of it. But here I say P1 to P8. If this grows, like if I have a hello in the middle, it adjusted. P1 to P8. Should be P1 to P8. Oh, yeah, P1 to P8, but I lost the word time. So time, let's change hello to ZZZ, so it's at the end. Oops. Sorry. Here. Oh, here I want ZZZ, sorry. So the ZZZ is showing here, but it doesn't show here because this specifically said P1 to P8. If instead I said P1 pound sign, that says, show me all of P1, the spill range of P1. Remember the spill error? And it showed what was highlighted. When I do that, it grows together. So without the dynamic arrays or without the news version, you have to do it with all these interesting formulas and hide them because you don't want that. But with it, it's a lot easier. Just sort, filter where it's not equal to blank. Okay, at this point, what I would like to do is take questions in the chat. Let's see, how do I get to the, okay, here it is. So we'll go to Alt-H, and no. Once again, chat, it said Alt-H, but that does something else. Okay, so if there's no questions, this is the material I had prepared. I hope you found it useful. If there are no questions, I actually can go on a little bit and show you a little bit how you can include this with data validation. I'm sorry, with conditional formatting. This was data validation. So I'm going to give this like 2 minutes and see if there are any questions. If not, I will show you a little bit of conditional formatting, which is quite interesting as well.
That was extremely involved.
Yes, it was.
And thank you very much for that, Bob. Again, I would ask the question, as Bob so rightly asked, are there any questions for Bob at this moment in time?
If there are no questions, I'm putting in, oh, thank you. I'm not a doctor, but thank you. I'm putting in my email address in the chat line. If at any time you have any questions, not on just data validation, but on almost anything to do with Excel, I'd be glad to answer. I also have 3 books published. One is called This Isn't Excel, It's Magic, which is my favorite one. And that's tips and tricks that you probably haven't seen before. I have another one called Excel Outside the Box, which is for advanced users. And then I have another one called More Excel Outside the Box, also for advanced users. And you could find this by typing my last name into Amazon.com to see all my books, as well as my wife's books. Oh, good.
We do actually have a question here, Bob.
Yeah, okay, what are the best practices for storing spreadsheet files? I'm not sure I know a good answer for that. If it's on your private or your own your own computer, best practices for storing them. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. You store them where you want to store them, where you know where they will be. and give it a useful name.
So Bob?
Yes.
Yes. So my question is, you know, without being a library scientist, right, we start to get a lot of Excel files where the names, you know, need to be version numbered or version controlled. And we have different people that are making revisions to files. And so they're checking them in, checking them out on Microsoft SharePoint. And so basically a way to control naming conventions and things of that nature. Do you have any recommended best practices to help people regarding storing their spreadsheets? So that's more of my question. What do you recommend to, you know, keep it
all right.
better, more
If you have different versions of a file, some people say you should just include a date in the name, which I don't recommend. It's okay, but the date is stored with the file anyway. The date that you save it, it's in there. You don't need to do it by name, but you can give yourself a V1, V2, any kind of suffix that you keep track of what the differences are if you need to do that. Put it in a folder. If it's not on SharePoint, put it in a folder that you know what it represents. So you may have a folder on pharmaceuticals. And within that, you might have a folder of training or whatever. But just you have to keep your own track of what the version, how it differs from the previous version. What I personally have done in when I was working, I'm now retired. When I was working, I pretty much kept only one previous version. And the company did the filing. They kept everything that was ever saved on the personal computers, the company computers. They backed up to a huge server, and everything that was ever saved was on there. With the name I gave it, but they still had it. It was always retrievable in case of a major crash. So I'm not sure I have the best answer for best practices for storing spreadsheet files, except it's up to you to make sure you know where things are saved. I know a lot of people save it and they go, what did I call that file and where did I put it? And you just need to be careful. I don't know if a good best practices thing. By the way, I also do consulting work and training individuals or companies if that's something you would like to use me for. Any other questions?
There seems to be a massive silence there.
Yes, it sure
Extremely
does.
loud.
Would you
So
like
Bob,
me to?
all really is left for me to do is to say thank you so much for your